Rex, did you do it?
Is this architect a serial killer cops have been hunting?
Gilgo Beach in New York, which faces the Atlantic Ocean and Great South Bay, has been facing a lot of press attention recently. More than a decade-old cold case had shown development, the arrest of a person. In the years 2010 and 2011, 11 bodies were discovered that were buried around the beach. Most of the dead bodies were of sex workers who advertised via Craigslist. The killing pattern of 4 bodies out of 11 was identical. The way they disappeared was also somewhat similar, and that made a person from Long Island suspect of the 4 murders. Investigators took time to solve the case, but they collected all the evidence before any arrest and caught a person named Rex Heuermann, aged 59, who was an architect, fond of hunting, and was living a double life. He managed to elude the police for more than 10 years, but no matter how perfect a crime is, justice always prevails. A call to 911 that appeared to be an alarm for much more than just a girl's disappearance opened the doors of jail for a person who was fond of hunting, but it was not deers or elk. The person preyed on vulnerable young women. A person who was confined in the serial killings of 4 females was a mystery in himself. This is a story of the Gilgo Beach serial killings that crossed all the limits of depravity. Maureen Brainard Barnes was a sex worker through Craigslist, a private advertising company in America operating a classified advertising website. She was working to pay the mortgage on her house. She was petite at just 4'11" in height. Barnes was last seen on 9th of July 2007. She was in New York at a Super 8 motel in Manhattan. She told a friend that she was going to meet a client outside the motel, but she never returned. Her daughter Nicolette was just 7 years old when she disappeared. Sarah Carnes, a friend of Brainard Barnes, used to know everything about Barnes.
Maureen was under a lot of pressure that weekend to make money. She was getting evicted.
She wasn't making enough money that weekend, and Maureen said
she is alive and is staying at the warehouse in Queens. He said he would call again and give her the address, but he never called back. His voice had a local accent. Melissa Barthelemy, aged 24 from New York, was another sex worker through Craigslist. She was last seen on July 12, 2009, at her residence. She was 4 feet and 10 inches. On the night she went missing, she deposited $900 in her bank account and tried to call her ex-boyfriend, but the call didn't connect. After a week of her disappearance, Melissa's teenage sister Amanda started getting vulgar, mocking, and insulting calls from an unknown caller. The calls were very disturbing and lasted for 5 weeks. The man sounded like a middle-aged person. He used to ask if she is a whore, like her sister.
It just didn't happen to the girls. I mean, it just destroyed all of our family.
He used to call and say her sister was dead and he was going to see her rot. Police traced the call to Manhattan, Madison Square Garden, and Massapequa, but were unable to determine who the caller was. Amber Lynn Costello, aged 27, was a resident of West Babylon, New York, a small town 10 miles west of Gilgo Beach with 2 male roommates. Amber was a sex worker and heroin addict. She had married twice. Costello was a teen when she got into drug addiction. A neighbor assaulted her when she was 6 years old. She was around 4'11" in height. She was last seen on September 2, 2010, when going to meet a stranger she had met several times before who used to pay her $1,500 for her services. At the time of her disappearance, her family expected her to be in a residential drug rehabilitation center, so she was not reported missing suddenly.
State Police.
Yeah, there's somebody after me.
I'm sorry?
There's somebody after me.
Where are you?
There's somebody after me.
Okay, where are you?
After that, she went missing in May 2010. Her mother, Mari Gilbert, took charge of finding her. After police investigated the place where Shannan was last reported alive, they were able to discover multiple bodies. Her body was found in December 2011 in another beach community down the road. Authorities said her death may have been accidental and not like the other murders. Mary considered her daughter an unintended hero whose search led to the finding of the other bodies. She was in her last phase of life, but chose to fight and pressurize police to be more attentive to the case and make at least one arrest in the case. Mary Gilbert was a woman with a heart of gold who did her best to bring justice to 4 innocents. Unfortunately, she was later murdered brutally by her other daughter, Sarah Gilbert, at the age of 52, who was schizophrenic. Sarah stabbed her mother 227 times with a 15mm knife, and then sprayed fire extinguisher foam in her mouth in 2016. Sarah was convicted and sentenced to 25 years in jail. A month after Shannan went missing, police started a quest for her around the location where she was last reported. Her clothes and belongings were found a week earlier than her body in the same vicinity. After a deep search by Officer John Malia and a German shepherd named Blue, police were able to find a dead body buried by the side of Ocean Parkway in Oak Beach on December 11, 2010. At first, they assumed that the body was Shannan's. Later, it was found to be someone else's. The investigation led to the finding of 10 more bodies, the remains of 4 victims. Megan Waterman, Melissa Barthelemy, Amber Costello, and Maureen Brainard Barnes were found 500 feet from each other. Gilgo's 4 bodies were wrapped in camouflage burlap, a kind of cloth that is used by hunters to hide while hunting. Among the 4 victims, Amber Lynn's body was the killer's most recent victim. Brainard's remains predate all of them. Waterman's body was the first that was discovered. One thing that was the same in the 4 victims was they all were petite, were sex workers, had advertised through Craigslist, and all died from strangulation. The investigators were joining all the points and tried to read the psyche of the killer. The other 6 bodies that were discovered on the island were believed to predate the other 4. They were identified as Jessica Taylor, Valerie Mack, an unidentified woman designated Jane Doe No. 3 or Peaches, and an unidentified toddler. Investigators were pinpointing all the locations from where Amanda was getting unknown calls. All the locations were closer to Gilgo Beach. The police were investigating the remains, the location, and around, but there were no arrests, suspects, or any promising lead. In the year 2015, the FBI officially came into the investigation. It took 13 years for the investigators to reach a point where they suspected someone. The first dot came from the vehicle Amber was last seen alive in. The vehicle was of her last client. A night before her disappearance, witnesses told investigators that a prostitute client had come to their home, but Amber's boyfriend made him leave. The witness said the client was driving a first-generation green Chevrolet Avalanche. The next day, Amber left her home to meet the same client outside and never returned. In March 2020, a registration search showed a person residing in Long Island owned a green first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche. According to the witness's description, the client appeared to be a large white man of about 6'4" to 6'6", in height aged around 44 or 45. The owner of the green first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche of Long Island resembles the description. This clue was the case's turning point. And now investigators had a suspect, along with the burner phones, car, and eyewitness description of his appearance. DNA also helped investigators in retrieving the suspect's identity. The bodies of 3 out of 4 victims had hairs that didn't match the victim's DNA, but when they were tested, they matched Mrs. Heuermann's hair. Her hair was found on the tape used to bind the bodies, but on the day of the murder, she was out of town, so she was never a suspect. On Waterman's body, there was a hair that was never sent for DNA test, but investigators had kept it safely. One day in Manhattan, Heuermann was seen throwing a pizza box after eating it in the trash. Investigators used the pizza crust to match the DNA to the hair, and it matched. On July 13, 2023, a group of suit-clad men came and surrounded him on a crowded New York street. and made the first arrest in decades of the older Gilgo murder series. When police searched his home, they found about 279 guns. 90 among them were licensed, and the rest were illegal. After an arrest in the case, victims regained some hope and were happy after seeing a positive and justice prevailing on their side. The attorney of the victims was with them since the very first call they made to her to ask for help. She was emotional during the arrest. Daughter of Brainard Barnes, Nicolette spoke for the first time in public about her mother's brutal murder. Heuermann's attorney said in the court that Heuermann is not guilty and they are dealing with the case. People living around Mr. Heuermann were shocked. Actor Billy Baldwin tweeted on the case and told the world that Heuermann was his classmate.
That call and formed a lifelong bond with the victims' families.
Was the first person, one of the family.
A woman who had worked with him shared her experience. He once asked about the cruise she was taking. She declined to be specific and said, "You are not going to find me in the middle of the ocean." He said, "Oh yes, I can." The next day, she got a letter under her door written, "I told you I could find you anywhere." And she was stunned. A former escort shared her experience. She was out to dinner with him 6 years before his arrest. She started discussing the Gilgo murder. He spoke about the case in a more personal way rather than taking it as a crime buff. After dinner, she declined her offer of a ride and called a friend to meet her outside the restaurant. An acquaintance of Mr. Heuermann said that once she went to his home, they were taking some measurements in his basement, and he asked her not to go in a room as there were a bunch of guns in it. A childhood friend of Heuermann took his interview for his channel Bonjour Reality and said he was a mind-boggling student. Rex Heuermann faced multiple life sentences without parole. In January 2024, he was indicted as the murderer of all 4 victims of Gilgo 4. His wife Asa Elarup filed for divorce after his arrest. Rex Heuermann was living a double life. His imposing personality, eye for detail, and criminal mind made him live his life in peace, even after 4 brutal murders. An architect working in a renowned company was living a simple life on the Long Island, and no one knew what else worse he was doing.